Carl Jung spent 40 years mapping the most dangerous territory in human psychology. Not mental illness, not violence, the territory of the fully awakened empath, and the final stage of development he called Sophia. Here is the discovery that still makes psychologists uncomfortable. The most dangerous people Jung ever documented were not the manipulators. They were not the narcissists. They were not the cold and calculating ones. They were the empaths who reached the Sophia stage. Specifically, the empaths who reached what Jung identified as the final and rarest stage of psychological development. The stage he connected to an ancient figure of wisdom, power, and complete inner wholeness. The Sophia stage. Jung believed that reaching this stage did not make a person gentle in the way that word is usually meant. It made them something far more significant. It made them a person who had moved close enough to their own wholeness that the usual tactics of manipulation stopped working, not because they had become cold, but because they had become complete. And completeness, Jung understood, cannot be exploited. Today, I am going to walk you through exactly what Jung discovered about this stage, why he considered it the most psychologically advanced state a human being could reach, and why the people who get there are so deeply threatening to the toxic and the manipulative that those people will do almost anything to pull them back down. This is the brutal truth about the most dangerous empath. And it starts with 4 stages. 4 stages that most people never even hear about, and almost none of them ever finish. Here is something worth sitting with before we go any further. The people who exploit empaths are not afraid of a sad empath. They are not afraid of an angry empath. They are not even afraid of an empath who finally walks away. What they are genuinely afraid of is an empath who has done the inner work and no longer needs their approval to feel whole. That kind of person cannot be brought back with charm. They cannot be manipulated with guilt. They cannot be pulled back into a dynamic they have fully seen through. Jung spent decades studying why that transformation happens to so few people. The answer lives in the 4 stages. Jung laid out a map. It was not a map of geography. It was a map of the inner world. Specifically, it was a map of what he called the Anima, the feminine archetype that Jung believed lived inside every man's psyche as a kind of soul image. In his work, The Psychology of the Transference, Jung described 4 distinct stages of how that inner feminine develops over the course of a man's psychological life. He named each stage after one of the most iconic feminine figures in human history: Eve, Helen, Mary, and Sophia. Modern Jungian analysts have since drawn on this framework to understand how deeply sensitive individuals, men and women alike, develop their inner life over time. It is worth being honest here. Jung himself never used the word empath. That is a contemporary term. What Jung wrote about were introverted feeling types, highly sensitive individuals attuned to the unconscious states of everyone around them. When we use the word empath in this video, we are using modern language to describe a pattern Jung documented under a different vocabulary. The underlying reality is the same. The stages describe a pattern that anyone who has ever felt everything too deeply will immediately recognize. Most people never make it past stage 2. The ones who reach stage 4 become something the world is not prepared for. The first stage is Eve. This is the most primal level. At this stage, the person's emotional life is almost entirely about survival and basic connection. Think of a child who only knows how to reach for comfort. Everything emotional is raw, unprocessed, and immediate. The empath at this stage feels everything, but has absolutely no tools to manage what they feel. They absorb the pain of everyone around them and have no way to sort out what belongs to them and what belongs to others. They are wide, open, completely unguarded, and because of that, they are incredibly easy to exploit. The second stage is Helen. This is where things get more complex. The person here has developed awareness of their own emotional intelligence. They know they are perceptive. They know they feel things others do not. But that awareness has not yet been paired with real inner strength. Helen is beautiful and powerful, but she is also reactive. She is the empath who wakes up to the fact that they have been used and responds with chaos, explosive grief, dramatic exits, cutting words delivered in moments of raw pain. This is the stage that most people confuse with growth. It is not growth. It is awakening without wisdom. It is a loaded weapon with no safety on. And here is the part most people in the Helen stage never want to hear. All of that chaos, those explosive confrontations, the cutting words delivered in moments of raw pain, it feels like power. It feels like finally standing up. And in one sense it is, but it is standing up without knowing where you are standing. The Helen stage empath has woken up to the fact that they have been wronged. What they have not yet done is the harder work of understanding why they allowed it, what inside them made that dynamic feel like love, and what needs to change so it never happens again. Most people skip that part. They take the anger and call it healed. Jung would say they have mistaken noise for progress. The real work is quieter, and it starts in the next stage. The third stage is Mary. Here, something begins to settle. The emotional storms quiet down. The person develops a genuine capacity for deep and lasting connection. They stop reacting and start choosing. They can feel the suffering of others without being swallowed by it. They can hold space. They can be present. Most empaths who reach this stage feel, for the first time, like they have finally found solid ground. And they have. But this is not the final destination. Because Mary, for all her grace and capacity for compassion, still has one vulnerability left. She still needs to be seen as good. She still needs her virtue to be acknowledged. That need, that final thread of dependence on the approval of others, is exactly what the Sophia stage burns away completely. The fourth stage is Sophia. And this is where everything changes. Jung borrowed this name directly from ancient wisdom traditions. Sophia is the Greek word for wisdom. In Jungian terms, the person who reaches the Sophia stage has moved deep into what Jung called the individuation process. It is important to say that word carefully. Individuation for Jung was never a finish line. It was a direction of travel. Empaths aren't broken. They're alchemists in progress. The alchemist's path gives you drills, Jung-based boundaries, and 3 exclusive chapter videos to turn overwhelm into clarity. By Surreal Mind, 236-page downloadable ebook, in stock. Begin now at thesurrealmind.com. A lifelong process of becoming more fully yourself. Jung wrote in The Practice of Psychotherapy that the Sophia stage represents the anima functioning as a guide to the inner life, mediating the contents of the unconscious to conscious awareness. He also described it as the stage that draws the individual closer to collective human suffering, not further from it. That is the detail most people miss. Sophia does not make you immune to pain. She makes you able to hold it with wisdom rather than be destroyed by it. And what drives that capacity is shadow integration. Consider a composite profile that illustrates the pattern observed across Jung's clinical work. Picture a highly sensitive person who, for most of their life, was the one everyone leaned on. The one who forgave when no one else would. The one who stayed when every instinct said leave. From the outside, they looked like the definition of selfless. On the inside, they were quietly building the most detailed psychological library you have ever seen. Every interaction catalogued, every shift in mood noted, every lie filed away, not out of malice, but because their nervous system was built to receive that kind of information. They were not keeping score. They were hardwired to perceive and store emotional truth. The problem was, they had never learned to act on any of it. And so all of that awareness just sat there, pressing down on them like a stone. Jung called this the empath's shadow. Not the darkness most people think of when they hear that word. Not cruelty or selfishness or aggression. No. The empath's shadow was made of suppressed strength, suppressed anger, a silenced voice that knew the truth for years and was trained, through people-pleasing and fear of abandonment, to stay quiet. Jung wrote extensively about the shadow in psychology and religion and ion, emphasizing that the shadow does not disappear simply because you refuse to acknowledge it. It accumulates, it grows heavier, and eventually, if the person does not consciously integrate it, it either implodes into depression or explodes into the Helen stage. Chaos we described earlier, but there is a third option, the option Jung found most extraordinary. The person chooses to look directly at their shadow without flinching and absorbs it into who they are. That process is shadow integration, and it is the single most transformative experience a human being can undergo. Here is what makes it so demanding. To integrate your shadow, you have to acknowledge that you contain every human quality you have ever judged in others. Not to use those qualities, not to become them, but to stop pretending they do not exist inside you. Jung was very specific about what this process is for. It is not about gaining access to a darker set of tools. It is about humility, real, deep humility, the kind that comes from knowing yourself completely enough that you stop projecting your own unowned darkness onto other people. The sensitive person who integrates their shadow does not become ruthless. They become responsible. They become someone who can recognize manipulation or cruelty without being blindsided by it, because they have already made peace with those same energies inside themselves. Jung himself wrote in Memories, Dreams, Reflections that his own confrontation with the unconscious nearly destroyed him. He was saved by his willingness to stay conscious while sitting with the darkest contents of his own inner world, not to use them as weapons, but to understand them. That is the work the Sophia stage requires, and it produces not a person who is more dangerous to others, but a person who is finally honest with themselves, but the ones who do. They come out the other side as something almost impossible to describe, using ordinary psychological language. They are not harder, they are not colder, they have not become cynical or detached. In fact, they are often warmer and more genuinely present than they have ever been before. The difference is that now warmth is a choice, not a compulsion, not a survival strategy, not an unconscious attempt to keep people close so they do not leave. It is a fully conscious, fully sovereign decision made from a place of complete inner stability. That is the core of what makes the Sophia stage so significant and so threatening. Think about what it actually means to interact with someone who has no unhealed wounds for you to press on, no old fears for you to activate, no desperate need for approval that you can exploit. Most social dynamics, especially manipulative ones, depend entirely on the target having at least one of those vulnerabilities in play. The charming person who never quite feels good enough. The loyal person who is terrified of being alone. The kind person who needs to be seen as the good one. Manipulators are extraordinarily skilled at finding these pressure points and applying just the right amount of force. But when they encounter a Sophia-level empath, there are no pressure points. The buttons are simply not there anymore. And this is not something that can be faked or performed. People sense it in their bones. Jung documented this in his case observations on what he called the integrated individual, noting that people of all psychological types respond to true integration with an almost primal recognition. The healthy ones feel safe. The predatory ones feel something closer to alarm. Consider another illustrative pattern drawn from the dynamics Jung observed across multiple cases. Imagine a woman who spent years in a relationship with someone who used her emotional intelligence against her. He knew she would always try to understand his behavior before judging it. He knew she would blame herself before blaming him. He knew her kindness was, at that stage of her development, essentially unconditional, and he used that for years. But something shifted. It did not happen overnight. It began with what Jung called the transcendent function breaking through, a sudden shift in consciousness, where the pattern recognition that had always been running quietly in the background became impossible to ignore. She saw everything, not with bitterness, not with rage, with a strange and unnerving calm. She understood his motivations completely, his childhood wounds, his insecurities, his deeply buried shame. She understood all of it, and she understood, in the same moment, that understanding someone is not the same as being obligated to them. That insight alone is worth sitting with, because it is the exact pivot point between the Mary stage and the Sophia stage. Mary understands and stays out of compassion. Sophia understands and makes a conscious choice, free from guilt, free from fear, free from the need to be the one who tried hardest. This is the stage where the empath becomes what Jung described as selectively empathetic. They do not lose their capacity for deep feeling. That capacity, if anything, expands. But it is no longer on offer to everyone who wants it. It is reserved for those who have earned it. And that selectivity, that quiet and absolute refusal to be emotionally available on demand, is what makes manipulative people so profoundly uncomfortable around a Sophia-level empath. They cannot figure out how to get in. There is no wound to pry open. There is no insecurity to magnify. There is no performance that will generate the right response. The usual tools simply stop working, and because those tools have always worked before, their failure is deeply disorienting. Jung observed this dynamic with great fascination in his later clinical work. He noted that patients who had reached a high level of integration seemed to create what he described as an almost involuntary sorting effect in their social environments. Toxic people found reasons to drift away or escalate into open aggression when their manipulation failed. Authentic people were drawn closer, sensing that here was someone safe enough to be fully known by. Jung wrote in The Development of Personality that the fully individuated person does not need to announce their power. It is simply present in the way they carry themselves, in the quality of their silence, in the fact that nothing you say or do seems to destabilize them. That stability is not indifference. It is the product of having faced everything inside themselves and having survived it all. Now, this is where the warning comes in. The Sophia stage person is not just harder to manipulate. They are, in a very specific sense, a genuine disruption to those who built their power entirely on the exploitation of others' emotional vulnerabilities. When a Sophia-level empath finally decides that a relationship is over, there is no drama, there is no tearful goodbye, there is no attempt to make the other person feel guilty or to get them to acknowledge their wrongdoing. There is simply a clean and complete withdrawal. No more emotional availability. No more absorbing the projections of someone else's unworked shadow. No more playing the role that was assigned to them in someone else's psychological drama. The exit is so quiet and so final that people often describe it as one of the most unsettling experiences they have ever had. They expected tears. They expected anger. What they got instead was a calm and unshakable no. And that no, delivered without apology and without negotiation, carries the full weight of everything the Sophia stage empath has worked through to get there. There is a distinction worth making here. There is a real difference between the empath who snaps and the empath who ascends. Both reach a breaking point. Both stop tolerating what they once absorbed. But what they do with that moment is completely different. The empath who snaps is still operating from the Helen stage. They react. The pain is real, but the root is still reaction, still being moved by someone else's behavior, still needing the other person to witness the damage they caused. The empath who ascends to the Sophia stage does something far more unsettling. They do not react, they conclude. There is no explosion because there is no longer any emotional charge attached to the person who caused the harm. The Sophia stage empath has processed the wound consciously enough that they are no longer controlled by it. Jung would not describe this as the other person becoming irrelevant. He would describe it as the wound being held with wisdom rather than reactivity. There is still feeling. There is still humanity. What is gone is the compulsion to perform that pain for an audience of one. That is not coldness. That is self-governance. Jung was direct about the social consequences of this kind of development. He wrote in The Undiscovered Self that the individual who achieves genuine psychological wholeness becomes a kind of living challenge to the collective, not because they are trying to be, but because their existence alone demonstrates that a different way of being is possible. They do not preach. They do not lecture. They do not wave their growth like a flag. They simply live in a way that makes the unconscious patterns of everyone around them harder to ignore. This is what he meant when he described highly developed individuals as culture carriers, not people who impose their values, but people whose presence quietly raises the standard of what is possible. So what does this mean for you? If you are watching this and recognizing yourself in the Sophia stage, Jung would say you are at one of the most significant thresholds a person can reach. The work required is not glamorous. It is not self-improvement that fits on a poster. It is the work of sitting with the parts of yourself you were most ashamed of and refusing to look away, grieving the relationships you held too long, unlearning the belief that your worth is measured by how much you give. It is brutal work. It is also, as Jung documented, the only path to the kind of freedom that cannot be taken from you. And if you are recognizing someone else here, someone who has recently gone quieter, less reactive, less available, Jung would suggest paying close attention to what that shift reveals. Not about them, about you. The integrated person has not changed the dynamic. They have simply stopped participating in one that was never healthy. When they stop, the dynamic has nowhere to hide. It becomes visible. And what you choose to do with that visibility is entirely yours. The Sophia stage is not an ending. Individuation is not a destination. It is a living, ongoing relationship with your own inner world. The shadow never fully disappears. It just becomes familiar. It stops being a monster in the dark and becomes a known presence you can name and choose not to be ruled by. That is the difference between someone who is integrated and someone who is only suppressed. Suppressed people look calm until they do not. Integrated people are calm because they have already been through the worst of themselves and come out the other side. Jung spent his career trying to understand what allowed certain people to carry the full weight of human experience without collapsing or becoming hardened. The Sophia stage was, in many ways, his answer. Not achieving perfect peace, achieving perfect honesty with yourself, becoming someone so thoroughly self-known that the external world loses its ability to destabilize you. That is the transformation, and that is, ultimately, the gift. What Jung was pointing toward was not danger in the aggressive sense. It was sovereignty. A sensitive person who has done this work can no longer be used as a container for other people's unintegrated shadow material. They can no longer be recruited into absorbing what others refuse to face in themselves. Jung believed that refusal to be one of the most significant things a person can do. Because when you stop absorbing what does not belong to you, you send it back to its source. And that is where real transformation, for everyone involved, has a chance to begin. The world does not need more sensitive people, silently holding everyone else together at the cost of themselves. It needs more people who have done this inner work, who meet the world not from compulsive service, but from conscious, freely chosen care. That is what Jung meant when he described the individuated person as a gift to the whole. Not because they sacrifice themselves, because they have finally stopped. And in stopping, they show everyone around them that it was never necessary to begin with. In The Alchemist's Path, perception training for empaths, you'll turn overwhelm into wisdom with practical drills, Jung-inspired boundaries, and step-by-step perception training. This guide includes 3 exclusive chapter videos to deepen each lesson. Written by Surreal Mind, 236 pages, beautifully designed 8.5 by 11 downloadable ebook, in stock now. Start your training today. Feel deeply while thinking clearly. Get The Alchemist's Path at thesurrealmind.com.